Hey, it's Drybear. We're continuing our series of covering all of the weapons in the First Descendant, and today we have fallen on the ultimate assault rifle, Fallen Hope. The weapon is actually, it's a beautiful weapon. It's very elegant, it's very cool, it has some decent stats on it, and its passive primarily revolves around dealing damage to targets that are poisoned, applying poison, and then when you eliminate enemies that are poisoned with this weapon, it can explode, dealing poison damage and spreading poison to all targets around, which in most cases does put this in the same category as a mobbing weapon. This is one that you use for clearing large area of mobs, and unfortunately the single target is not really anything to write home about, but as always, I like to include many options for people because I know PvE games are all about personal comfort and enjoying your grind time, so we're gonna go through all the different sides and angles of the Fallen Hope rifle today. Starting with the bossing representation, and partly I did this because I know people will want to use this for bossing. There are people out there that don't really care about S tier, A tier, tier lists, whatever's the best. They just like a weapon and they like holding it, and that's how they enjoy themselves when they're farming the same dang thing over and over and over, but also just as a representation so we can compare it to other weapons as well. So if you ran this weapon as a bossing weapon, this is the build that I would run. It does have decent crit damage scaling, but pretty poor crit chance scaling, and overall has some good scaling on the usual suspects like firearm attack, that sort of thing. The maxed out, fully rolled, 4 golden rolls, maxed out mods, fully catalyzed DPS single target for this weapon, if you ran it as a bossing weapon, is 560k. So it's not really that great for single target. It really doesn't serve as that purpose. And for the most part, the best single target, now this is the last assault rifle that we've done, the best single target bossing assault rifle is the Eternal Willpower. So that would be a better option for that purpose there. And these would be the stat weights. I also did a test on this, an update on the left side of the screen. I don't know if this is, let me know your opinion. Some people have said that they wanted more mods and their relative weighting shown on here. At a certain point, this is going to get too small to read if we add too many. And then also a lot of people are very confused by the grouping system in the First Descendant. So maybe it's just them getting caught up on that process. But if you go to like adding mods to a weapon, do you see this little thing underneath the mod itself, like firearm critical hit or special mod? That is the group for the module, and in this game you cannot have 2 mods of the same group in one build. As soon as you add one that has special mod, you cannot add any others that share that same group because you can only have one of each kind. As soon as you add, the biggest one too that people get confused by, is as soon as you add ATK, which is a purple firearm attack, you cannot add any more ATKs in order to that category because the group has already been filled out by that. A lot of the blues don't have categories. They don't have anything listed here, so you can mix and match as many as you want. So what I did is I added those to this, but let me know if this is just information overload to have too much stuff on the left side of the screen. I like having options so you can kind of mix and match. You can see which of these you would swap out, but this would be the best single target option. But to me, this is not really what you would use this weapon for if you're trying to bring out the best in it. This would be the optimal setup for Fallen Hope, and that is to use it as a mobbing weapon. Use it for spreading poison, triggering the explosion effect, or triggering with descendant focused things. The most obvious synergy here is this weapon was kind of really made for Freyna. Freyna has a passive that gives her more damage when there are more targets nearby that are poisoned. You can also run mods that spread poison, and because she can increase her damage with poison, when there is poison, running a weapon that does poison and does more damage with poison and spreads poison, like all of that just really synergizes together. So if you are running this with a Freyna toxic skill build with a mobbing setup on Fallen Hope, I would say it's about equivalent to a Thunder Cage, and in some cases it can do more damage than Thunder Cage, just do it a little bit less effectively, right? Because since this is partially dot focused damage, you're gonna have to wait for the dots to tick, and in some cases while you're mobbing, mobs will die before the full duration of the dot has gone through. So in a lot of cases, Thunder Cage is going to outperform this just because its damage is instantaneous, whereas this is damage over time. It has spread chance and all of that. Plus Thunder Cage, when fully maxed out, has a 100% proc chance on the explosion. When the Fallen Hope is fully maxed out, it has a 40% proc chance. So you're not gonna be able to proc this every single time you eliminate an enemy, even though they're poisoned, so you're gonna have some synergy there. So this would be my recommendation for the builds for the weapon if you're running if you're running Freyna, you can get the DPS close to 1,000,000 in a mobbing AoE situation. The more mobs there are, the more damage that goes up, by the way. So in massive hordes of enemies, so like the wave-based minions, the special operations, running Freyna with this weapon can actually be extremely effective because a lot of those mobs have higher HP towards the end, like the final wave when you start getting catalysts. That can be really useful. In like low HP mob situations, the Thunder Cage is going to be a bit better. And if you're running any character, not just Freyna, but you're running the AoE setup, it can still be a pretty good mobbing weapon at 834,000 DPS. You would, I think the value of Real Life Fighter is very high here, but I honestly don't recommend it for the final build. You can see in the final build, I have Sharp Precision Shot. In most cases, I do recommend Real Life Fighter because the value, even when you don't fully stack it, is like super good. But I also feel like you want to focus on spreading poison and triggering poison through the elemental passive. And I feel like Real Life Fighter just isn't really something you want to focus on. And this weapon specifically, with the right mods, Sharp Precision is a very high value on that as well. It can get it fully stacked. The TT is just right. And especially if you're running something like, slower attack rate or Sharp Precision, all of it works fine. So I think the final build is Sharp Precision Shot. You want to run the staple action and reaction rifling reinforcement. There's not really anything in the game that makes you remove these. These are just insanely good, and they're going to find their way into every build. And then the other thing that's worth talking about, so let's talk about the dots and how they work separate from this before we go to these, because I'm sure there's going to be people out there wondering, why is there 1, 2, 3, 4 reload and rounds mods in here, plus an accuracy mod on a weapon that does dot damage? And the reason for that is the way that the dots from the weapon work. Now, if we're talking about Thunder Cage, is something I covered in my Thunder Cage video, but you can actually, the Thunder Cage will trigger, you just won't be able to get the Thunder Cage explosion to scale with electric damage, and the same is kind of true with Fallen Hope. Electric, like Toxic Priority or Toxic Gun Barrel, do scale the dot and the explosion from Fallen Hope, but they do it at a very reduced rate, which makes them almost meaningless to run. The next thing that's worth mentioning here as well is that, especially if you're running Freyna Fallen Hope, Freyna's dots or poisons, because they're skills, they can deal damage and crit. So you can see those orange numbers, that's a crit. All of Freyna's poison effects and dots do crit and can have the crit scaling on them as well. However, the difference with this is that if you go here, you'll notice that it scales off of the skill critical hit damage and skill critical hit rate, not firearm critical hit damage and firearm critical hit rate. There's no way to connect these two, and the dots that come from Fallen Hope actually don't trigger any crits at all. They have no crit scaling, no procs, nothing that will give them that extra value. So you actually can't run any crit damage on these. The crit scaling isn't really super worth it. So even if we run here and we try to trigger poison on these folks, if we get an explosion on our low percent rate, they're not going to have any crit scaling. And so realistically, if you're running Fallen Hope as a mobbing weapon, your best choice is to just allow you to run more rounds, faster reloads, faster fire rate, so that you can spread more poisons, trigger more explosions, and you have more uptime on that passive that you're using to clear out enemies in an area. And again, your best usage of this is going to be with Freyna, but you can still get decent mobbing with it if you wanted to run it on others as well. So if we jump back here, normally we would have some pretty high weightings on like concentration, like better concentration, concentration priority, even like target detection or better insight. But because none of those crits apply to the explosion or the subsequent poison dot, and they don't transfer over to Freyna when you're running a poison build, it's hard for me to recommend any crit related things because they're so cut off from the environment. And you also notice that in this build, usually I recommend elemental enhancement versus weakness. In this case, I would recommend just running toxic enhancement. The big reason here is that you want to be able to have the weapon trigger poisons on its own. You can run this with Freyna and do her poisons and then shoot, but realistically, it's much better if the weapon itself can actually trigger poison on its own. You're going to get 100% value of this on targets, even if they're not weak to toxic. You get a 33% damage increase to targets that are weak to toxic, so if they're electric, but losing that is fine for the ability to always trigger poisons. And one downside, another hard restriction in this game that makes builds a little bit more confusing, is that you can't trigger more than one status effect with a single source. And what this means is, if you ran, say you ran like Fire Attack on Fallen Hope and then chill enhancement on the modules, it will take whichever of the two does more damage and only apply that status effect. So if you had fire attack on your weapon and then like chill attack on your modules, whichever one does more damage, then it'll trigger either frostbite or burn. And realistically for this weapon, you want it to always trigger poison. And that's why I recommend just getting a maxed out toxic enhancement. It gives you extra toxic. You can even run flat toxic damage on the weapon as well with decent weighting, and that gives you a good coverage for the weapon as well. You'll notice that flat toxic damage is recommended here in the top right corner. So that is the reason why we run expand weapon charge, reload expert, concentrate support ammo, recycling focus, and aiming compensation. On the passive for Fallen Hope here, you do get a minus amount, like the passive gives you minus 40% accuracy. When this is fully upgraded, it's still minus 20%, but if you run it with aiming compensation, this gives you 30% more accuracy, which will get you to about 90 plus X% accuracy, which is good enough for this weapon. It has a decent spread. The recoil pattern on it is pretty straightforward as well. The recoil pattern to me is almost like the lightning bolt on Harry Potter's head. It goes up to the right, straight over to the left, and then up to the right again. So it goes like that, and then it goes up again. It's basically a Harry Potter lightning bolt. It's very straightforward, and it moves very slowly as well. The bloom isn't too bad on the weapon. It caps out, and it doesn't fire fast enough, even with fire rate up, to make that more of a concern. So I think that one is fine. But again, we have the weighted list on the left side of the screen so that you can kind of play around with this and swap these in and out if you want. This is usually I put top DPS here, but if you're running a mobbing version of the weapon, all you're doing is maximizing the amount of time you're firing the weapon. You care a lot less how much damage the weapon has, except for firearm attack. So we still want to run sharp precision shot. We still want to run rifling reinforcement. We still want to run action and reaction because our firearm attack does scale our explosion. It scales our poison dot damage, and it scales the bullets that we do and the elemental damage that we do, but it doesn't really, there's no other stat that's like a slam dunk win for this weapon. So you just want to maximize the uptime of you doing the rat-tat-tat, because that means that you'll be triggering more status buildup, you'll be triggering more poison procs, and triggering more explosions, which makes this the mobbing weapon that it is. Additionally, I want to give a special mention to the swap recon set bonus. This one will give you toxic skill power as well as firearm status effect trigger rate. This will help you trigger more poisons from the Fallen Hope, and it gives you skill duration as well, which is useful for Freyna. So if you're running the Freyna Fallen Hope build, I would recommend picking up swap recon for just general farming. You can probably do different sets here if you're doing bossing in general, but again, if you're running bossing, I wouldn't really rely on the Fallen Hope as much, as the single target is not really anything special. Also keep in mind that running things that expand the weapon charge, like expand weapon charge, can be really good if you're running the Freyna build as well, because it can affect her special weapon in that way. So this is the final verdict on the Fallen Hope build. It actually ended up being pretty close to the Thunder Cage if used optimally and with proper synergies. Even without those synergies, it still does pretty good as a mobbing weapon, and it's a fun, good looking weapon that does some pretty cool effects that are fun to look at. But as a single target bossing weapon, I wouldn't recommend it for that build, and specifically this one, just like the Thunder Cage, is best used as an AoE mob clearing weapon. But let me know what you think about the weapon down below, and what weapon you are waiting for the next video as well. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.